The European Union has struck an outline trade deal with Donald Trump, which, shall we say, is getting a mixed reception, to say the least. It's important because US-EU trade is a big part of the world trading system, and also because of what it tells us about the realignment, or not, of major players in response to the new MAGA United States. So let's discuss, first of all, two big trading partners, both of them confidently positioning themselves as tough negotiators, delivering positive outcomes for their citizens. So you would assume this was a pretty well-balanced trade deal, seen as a win-win for both sides, right? Well, of course not. The only deals Trump is doing, as we have seen, are deals that are one-sided in favour of the United States, and while the degree of one-sidedness and exploitation may differ based on the relative strength of the other party, it's an American first deal or it's no deal. The principal benefit for the non-American side is that Trump agrees to only unilaterally hit them half as hard as he was previously going to do. So it was in this case. Trump had threatened to hit Europe with 30% baseline tariffs from the 1st of August if no deal was struck, and they got him down to 15%. In return, they gave him access to chunks of the European market for 0%. Before Trump started this bullying exercise, the basic tariff amount on EU goods going into the US was about 4.8%, although if you averaged it across all products, it was around about 1.4%. Now, in return for only hitting them half as hard as he was going to, the EU promised to spend an extra $750 billion over the next 3 years on US energy, which is curious, because that's close to the total amount of exported energy from the US in total, so it's not clear how that promise actually gets delivered. The EU also promised to invest $600 billion in America. We'll come back to that one in a moment. And this one's a kicker, to buy a vast amount of US military equipment. Trump claimed hundreds of billions of dollars worth. Now that matters, because European countries had been clear that given Trump's recent performance on Ukraine and Russia, they needed to reduce the risk of their exposure to US military equipment that the US could conceivably refuse to allow to be used in various circumstances. And that was held to be an urgent matter of national security. Now, obviously, Trump didn't want that to happen. He didn't want non-US firms to benefit from his bullying Europe to spend more on defence, and I'm guessing he didn't want them to have wholly independent control of those mechanisms for defence. Now, this commitment doesn't mean that the EU doesn't continue to look to diversify defence suppliers, but it's clear that Trump has pushed them into a subservient role to an unreliable US they would not have chosen for themselves. But then it's also an open question how much of this outline deal, which means no deal at all as we understand trade deals, will actually stick. The EU has been forced to admit, just hours after the agreement, that the $600 billion worth of investment that's promised to go into the United States is wholly out of its power to deliver. That extra investment would have to come from private companies. You know, the sort that don't have to do what the European Union tells them to. So why is it even in the so-called deal? Why didn't they promise other things, like a steady supply of fairies and unicorns to help supercharge the president's cryptocurrencies or something? Reportedly, that $600 billion promise played a key role in getting the agreement over the line. Obviously, it delights Trump, because he can say back home, look how I'm winning for America. But it's hope and aspiration rather than a promise. It might well be delivered. The EU currently has $2.8 trillion worth of private investment in the US, which generates around 3.4 million jobs, and that's the sort of figure where you could see organic growth over the next few years could easily reach an additional $600 billion, assuming it grows at all with the added tariffs and the various other issues. Numerous voices inside the EU and outside have been raised since the announcement to either condemn the deal roundly or to welcome it in lukewarm terms as the least worst option. So French Prime Minister François Bayrou described the deal as submission by Brussels, branding it as a dark day for Europe. Trump fan Hungary's Viktor Orban said that Ursula von der Leyen had been eaten for breakfast by President Trump. Others were being pragmatic, you rather suspect through gritted teeth. France's Minister for Europe was more diplomatic than his Prime Minister, at least. He said the agreement would provide temporary stability, but it is unbalanced. The German bank Berenberg also heaved a sigh of relief at a momentary pause in the, quote, crippling uncertainty, but also said that yes, it was a victory for Trump. It is great to have a deal. In two major respects, however, the outcome remains much worse than the situation before Trump started his new round of trade wars early this year. Well, yes, that's rather the whole point of why he started the trade wars. Since the EU never did strike back against those initial tariffs, it's not particularly surprising the Trump side never backed down from wanting a wholly unequal deal. Indeed, this was central to a Financial Times analysis of how the US-EU deal got to where it was. The deciding moment, according to the FT, was that while China quickly reciprocated tariffs against Trump after his initial tariff blitz on April the 2nd, the EU geared up to do the same, but then on April the 10th, the day after Trump had paused his tariffs, the EU suspended its own retaliatory tariffs. Quote, rather than join Canada and China with instant retaliation and inflict pain on US customers and businesses, the EU, hamstrung by divergent views amongst the member states, chose to take the pain in hope of securing a better deal. But it turns out that strength is what secures a better deal in the face of a bully. Or as one EU diplomat put it, he's the bully in the schoolyard. See, I'm not the only one who uses that analogy all the time. And we didn't join others in standing up to him. Those who don't hang together get hanged separately. Former Commission official Jorg Reculus, who helped negotiate the UK's Brexit deal, he said the EU's recent threat of retaliatory tariffs came too late. With the benefit of hindsight, the EU would have been better off answering the US vigorously in April in a 1-2 combo with China's retaliation against the US tariff hikes, which left markets and Trump reeling. It's worth noting, because this deal is symbolic of something quite important in the geopolitical dance around Trump's America. We already discussed in a recent video how China has been wooing those who have been affronted by the Trump tariff assault against them. But also that the recent EU-China summit was tense due to various outstanding issues between them. Notwithstanding that, China is presenting itself as more stable and more reliable than Trump. But that doesn't mean to say it's offering an easy deal with no strings attached. And arguably this deal between the EU and the US, particularly with the promise of major military spending with the US, suggests that having stared in the face the possibility of a choice between the two giants, well, they have made their choice. And in spite of all of their big talk that had followed the initial shocks from Trump's support of Putin and Trump's tariff assault against them all, in the short term, at least, they are nevertheless making their bet that the US will be the least worst to go with. Now, it's too early to tell how exclusive that is. Trump has included explicitly anti-China clauses in some of the deals with Southeast Asian countries, and bearing in mind these very open general outline deals are perfect for inserting new clauses in while you're firming up the details, well, it remains to be seen if anti-China elements are going to become a point of focus. The problem for the EU remains that it is a bloc of 27 different countries who can be guaranteed to disagree on big points of strategy. Germany and France, amongst others, were in there arguing for the Commission to use the tools it had already identified to resist coercion, namely barring US companies from public tenders, revoking intellectual property protections, and restricting imports and exports. That was a plan that was put together after the first Trump presidency, strangely enough. But other member states were not keen on what you might describe as the nuclear approach, and they were pushing for more strategic patience. Their best argument was that the damage done to European businesses from a spiralling trade war would simply be too great. And unlike China, they didn't have a killer response in the toolbox, i.e. the withholding of crucial rare earth magnets from American businesses. And also, being comprised of 27 democracies, some of them more fragile than others, taking on the pain of such a trade war would likely result in serious internal pushback, a lot harder and a lot quicker than ever would happen under authoritarian China. Obviously, the US side is just chanting USA, USA on social media in response to this agreement. Vice President JD Vance, for instance, who tweeted this: "The entire European press is singing the president's praises right now, amazed at the deal he negotiated on behalf of Americans." That is a bit of a bizarro land interpretation, though, to be fair. The European press that I've seen when reviewing Reaction was certainly recognising the obvious reality that Trump had achieved a wholly unequal deal. They were more focused on displeasure at their own side, or resignation at the least worst option, than they were expressing any sort of admiration for Trump's bullying. Vance's comments are typical of the type of American who believes the rest of the world views events through exactly the same lens that he does. Anyway, he then goes on to swipe at the American media because, well, of course he did. Tomorrow, the American media will undoubtedly run headlines like "Donald Trump only got 99.9% of what he asked for." And so it continues, with the MAGA side and their apologists continuing to miss the real damage they are doing to themselves. Because nobody has disputed, that I've seen anyway, that the biggest bully in the playground, I say it again, can extort unequal deals from partners who, back in the days when they trusted the US, allowed themselves to become embedded and vulnerable to it. Short term, yes, you can impose tariffs and then celebrate the income the US is getting from its own businesses and citizens paying that additional tax, with the cost of some suppression of trade with other countries to their harm and to yourselves. So short term, yes, you can turn around to countries that used to consider themselves as your allies and you can extort them to enrich yourself. No doubt that gets some short-term benefits and rewards, so enjoy those. Longer term, though, even with the EU being too craven to stand up to the bullying while it's in process, these countries are well advanced in changing their systems, creating new alliances and reducing their vulnerability. At no point in history has a world superpower been so almighty that it didn't need allies. In the short term, roasting those allies, turning them over, that can give you a satisfying buzz that you're serving your country well. What you're actually doing, though, is destroying its midterm future for the sake of a short-term high, like a drug addict stealing money from friends and family to score the next hit, and ending up sad and alone at a point where you most need friends to support you because you drove them all away. Now look, sure, geopolitics isn't quite as simple as that example, but these basic dynamics of cause and effect are universal constants. So yes, this will come home to roost. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not the day after, but soon enough.